The world keeps saying the UK is a middle power, a polite euphemism for irrelevant. But that illusion collapses the moment you look at how wars in 2026 are actually deterred, shaped, and decided. Because the British military doesn't project dominance with mass or manpower. It exerts influence through assets that change the calculations of superpowers. Nuclear submarines that vanish into the Atlantic with enough firepower to alter continents. Carrier groups that appear in the Indo-Pacific without warning and rewrite diplomatic behavior. Intelligence networks that intercept conversations from Moscow to Mogadishu before adversaries even realize they leaked. And alliances, AUKUS, NATO, Five Eyes, that hardwired Britain into the command architecture of the free world. No other European military can do all of this at once. Most don't even try. And that's the secret. Britain doesn't need to be the biggest. It needs to be the one actor whose capabilities force adversaries to change their entire plan. That is what makes the UK a game changer. Not volume, but consequence. And once you map each capability that Britain brings to a global crisis, a pattern becomes unavoidable. Every lever the UK controls reshapes the battlefield before the first shot is fired. If you want to understand the real distribution of power in 2026, you start with the one military everyone underestimates, and every adversary privately fears. And the first reason sits deep under the Atlantic. The biggest illusion in modern security analysis is the belief that Britain is a secondary nuclear state, a polite participant in NATO's umbrella rather than a strategic actor in its own right. That misconception dies the moment you examine how the UK's nuclear deterrent actually functions in 2026. Britain does not simply possess nuclear weapons. It maintains the only uninterrupted, continuously deployed sea-based deterrent in NATO besides the United States. One submarine vanishes into the Atlantic every minute of every day, year after year, with enough destructive power on board to terminate any great power war before it begins. And unlike the United States, Britain's firing authority does not depend on Washington. It has its own prime minister, its own command chain, its own encrypted launch protocols, and its own strategic logic. This creates a problem for Russia and China that analysts rarely articulate. They cannot model NATO escalation as a single decision. They must model two independent nuclear triggers, each with sovereign authority, each capable of responding without the other. No other European military force is adversaries to confront that complexity. Every nation that builds nuclear weapons aims for deterrence. The UK achieves something far more destabilizing for hostile planners: ambiguity. They cannot predict how Britain will react. They cannot assume the United States will restrain it, and they cannot map a single escalation ladder. Any conflict with NATO now carries the risk of a British nuclear response independent of US political calculations. That alone reshapes Moscow's and Beijing's risk models before a crisis even begins, and the modernization makes this even sharper. The £15 billion warhead upgrade program, largely quiet, barely covered, and already underway, ensures Britain's arsenal stays credible into the 2000s and 70s. While Russia stretches itself thin with parallel modernization and China races to triple its stockpile, Britain is making a simpler, more dangerous move. Fewer weapons, but guaranteed survivability, guaranteed accuracy, and guaranteed ambiguity about targeting priorities. What adversaries fear most is not the weapon. It's the certainty that they cannot find it, cannot track it, and cannot stop it. A single Vanguard submarine, silent and undetectable, carries enough firepower to end the war Russia pretends it could fight in Europe. And its successor, the Dreadnought class, escalates that survivability even further with acoustic signatures so low that even China's next-generation underwater sensors cannot reliably detect them. This is why Britain's nuclear deterrent matters more now than at any time since the Cold War. It is the one capability that forces both Russia and China to consider the possibility that they cannot control escalation, cannot intimidate Europe, and cannot assume American political cycles will give them openings. Most NATO members contribute troops. Britain contributes global uncertainty, the most valuable form of deterrence in the nuclear age. And yet, the submarines only represent the silent dimension of British power. Because when the conversation shifts from deterrence to projection, Britain stops hiding beneath the waves and starts rewriting the balance of the Indo-Pacific itself. The easiest mistake analysts make when judging Britain's military weight is looking at troop numbers instead of reach. Wars in 2026 aren't shaped by how many soldiers you can field. They're shaped by how fast you can move force, how long you can sustain it, and how far you can project it without asking permission. And this is where Britain immediately breaks out of the middle power narrative, because only 3 NATO nations operate true carrier strike capability: the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. And only one of them can deploy that power in 2 strategic theaters simultaneously without collapsing its entire naval schedule: the UK. HMS Prince of Wales proved this in 2025 during Operation High Mast, a deployment so underreported that most observers didn't understand what it demonstrated. For 8 months, the UK led a multi-nation task group across the Indo-Pacific, exercising with the US, Japan, India, Australia, South Korea, and regional partners. At its peak, the strike group surged to 4,500 personnel and up to 24 F-35B jets, a 5th-generation air wing capable of suppressing integrated air defenses, eliminating naval targets, and supporting expeditionary operations across thousands of miles. This wasn't a ceremonial flag wave. It was proof that Britain can operate as a strategic hinge, a power that closes the gap between Europe and Asia when the United States is overstretched. Russia cannot replicate this, China cannot disrupt it, and Europe cannot substitute it. Carrier strike changes the psychology of adversaries because it removes their home field advantage. When a Royal Navy carrier enters a region, it doesn't request access. It brings its own runway, its own refueling, its own strike fighters, and its own command and control network. Moving that entire ecosystem across oceans is something only great powers can do, and yet Britain does it without pretending to be one. That is what makes it dangerous. It delivers great power effects without great power vulnerabilities, and the operational message of High Mast was unmistakable. If a crisis breaks out in the Taiwan Strait, the UK can put F-35s over the battle space. If tensions erupt in the South China Sea, Britain can escort partners, reinforce choke points, or enforce coalition sea control. If a crisis emerges in the Middle East, the carrier can pivot west without waiting for US availability. This is the capability that turns Britain from a European actor into a global military problem for adversaries. A nation with a carrier battle group that can deploy east or west is a nation that forces China and Russia to stretch their own planning bandwidth. They must track a mobile runway that leaves no predictable pattern and no political dependency. But the carrier is only one half of this mobility equation. Because while the strike group demonstrates expeditionary reach, the next capability shows how Britain plans to dominate the future of undersea warfare itself. And it's tied to an alliance the rest of the world still hasn't fully understood. Most alliances create interoperability. AUKUS creates dependency on Britain. That is the part almost every commentator misses. They treat AUKUS like a geopolitical gesture, a diplomatic symbol, or a submarines program stretched over decades. But in 2026, AUKUS is something far more consequential. A 50-year military-industrial regime in which the UK becomes the technological spine for how the United States and Australia operate undersea, in cyber, in AI, and in quantum warfare. The world saw the headlines. What it didn't see was the shift in power underneath them. The 2025 UK-Australia Treaty locked Britain into producing SS and AUKUS attack submarines every 18 months, the most advanced hunter killers any Western Navy will field outside the US Navy's own next-generation fleet. These boats are not upgrades. They are a new class of undersea dominance built around British reactor engineering, British stealth architecture, British hydrodynamics, British combat systems, and British manufacturing pipelines. And that is exactly why China reacted with fury. Because for the first time, the Indo-Pacific naval balance hinges on designs, technologies, and production cycles controlled in Barrow-in-Furness. Not Washington, not Canberra, not Tokyo. AUKUS Pillar 2 makes this even more decisive. The public fixated on submarines, but the real power lies in the second half of the pact. Artificial intelligence, autonomous undersea drones, hypersonic weapons, quantum secure communications, and cyber warfare tools that the UK is co-authoring. These technologies define future conflict far more than any frigate or tank, and Britain is shaping the standards, code, and architecture that 3 major democracies will use. This is not burden sharing. This is technology leadership. A £176 billion partnership across 3 decades means the UK isn't just part of AUKUS. It is baked into the operating systems of 2 continents. And with £6 billion invested in submarine infrastructure and tens of billions flowing through BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, the UK becomes the central node of a trilateral military-industrial empire. Adversaries can't replicate that. Russia can't afford it. China can only watch as its naval dominance plans face a coalition anchored by technology it doesn't understand and production lines it can't sabotage. AUKUS makes Britain irreplaceable, not because it is big, but because it is the only state with the industrial discipline, nuclear pedigree, and design sovereignty capable of enabling a multi-ocean submarine fleet for allies. But AUKUS is still a long-term structure. The next shift Britain is engineering is happening now, at a speed and scale that traditional militaries can't match. The countries preparing for the next war are pouring money into drones and data. The country preparing to win that war is building something else entirely. An AI-driven targeting ecosystem that turns every British unit, on land, sea, air, and undersea, into a node in a lethal, self-updating web. And that is where the UK stops behaving like a mid-tier European power and starts behaving like a prototype for the future of warfare. The Strategic Defense Review 2025 didn't talk about modernization or capability upgrades. It talked about a 10-fold increase in lethality by 2035, not by adding troops or vehicles, but by rewiring the military around AI, automation, and decision speed dominance. Britain isn't copying American doctrine. It's doing something the US military is still struggling to implement. Integrating frontline sensors, deep learning engines, satellite networks, electronic warfare feeds, and autonomous systems into a unified kill chain that compresses targeting from minutes to seconds. This isn't a theory. It's happening right now. The Defense Artificial Intelligence Center, DAIC, runs with a protected £400 million annual budget. UK defense innovation adds another £400 million annually. And British private sector AI firms like PhysicsX, which pulled $155 million in 2025, are outpacing the innovation pipelines of entire European militaries. The result is not a modern army. It's an army that fights algorithmically. The new Recce Strike doctrine shows the shift clearly. Old reconnaissance found targets. New British reconnaissance hunts them. AI-assisted targeting identifies vehicles by exhaust signatures, drone swarms map enemy formations in real time, and autonomous systems distribute fire missions across artillery units before an enemy even finishes its movement. The UK has committed at least 10% of its equipment budget to drones and novel technologies, a structural decision that most NATO states can't afford and Russia can't emulate. This is the advantage Britain understands. Mass is expensive. AI is exponential. Every year the system learns. Every year lethality compounds. By 2030, British forces won't simply outshoot adversaries, they will outcycle them. They will detect faster, decide faster, strike faster, and relocate faster than any opponent relying on traditional command structures. And while China and the US race for AI supremacy, Britain is doing something far more strategic. Embedding AI deeply into doctrine, procurement, and operations now, while the technology is still shaping itself. This is how a smaller military breaks out of its demographic limits. But when algorithms reach their limit, Britain turns to the most feared, most surgical, and most politically flexible instrument in its arsenal. When politicians talk about military power, they talk about divisions, fleets, brigades, and budgets. When adversaries talk about Britain in private, they talk about 3 letters, SAS. Because no matter how many carriers the UK launches or how much AI it deploys, the most feared instrument of British power is still the one that moves without publicity, acts without hesitation, and disappears without attribution. British Special Forces, SAS, SBS, SRR, and the newly formalized tiered structure are Britain's asymmetric advantage in a world where deniable precision is worth more than massed firepower. For 20 years, the UKSF community co-evolved with the US Joint Special Operations Command, forming what analysts now describe as the most effective counter-terrorist strike architecture in history. But the story people don't tell is how far Britain has expanded that capability since. UKSF isn't a boutique elite club. It's the backbone of Britain's global reach. The 2025 Strategic Defense Review elevated the Commando Force and 16 Air Assault Brigade to NATO Level 2 Special Operations status, creating a 3-tier system unlike anything else in Europe. Level 1. Army Rangers, training, influence, partner force support, hybrid missions. Level 2. Commando Force and 16 Air Assault, rapid intervention, Contested environment operations, maritime and airborne infiltration. Level 3, SASSBS sovereign units. Strategic raids, hostage rescue, covert disruption, deniable missions. This structure gives UK commanders something most NATO nations envy: the ability to scale. Britain can send a dozen advisors to shape a partner force, a battalion-sized commando strike group to seize a critical node, or a single SAS troop to eliminate a threat quietly. And it can do all this without triggering the political friction that cripples larger militaries: Syria, Iraq, Somalia, the Baltic, the Sahel. Every conflict zone over the past decade has had the same rumor. The British were here before anyone said a word. And there's a reason those rumors exist, because UKSF is not simply a tactical capability, it is a strategic instrument. It gives Downing Street options when diplomacy collapses, but open conflict would be a mistake. It gives NATO the ability to shape the battle space without escalating to industrial warfare. It gives allies intelligence, training, and surgical power they cannot generate themselves. Meanwhile, the expansion of cadet forces toward 250,000 members by 2030 ensures a recruitment pipeline that keeps elite units manned while other nations face demographic collapse. Britain isn't just preserving special forces, it's future-proofing them. But even the best special forces cannot operate everywhere. They need staging points, logistics, intelligence feeds, and global infrastructure. And this is where Britain does something no European nation, and few global powers, can match. Most militaries project force outward. Britain projects presence. And that is far more dangerous. The UK's basing footprint isn't a relic of empire or a scatter of outposts. It's a strategically aligned, globally distributed staging architecture that gives Britain something no other European military possesses: the ability to initiate, sustain, and escalate operations on 3 continents without asking for regional permission. Look at the map through a military lens, not a political one. Gibraltar controls the gateway to the Mediterranean. Cyprus projects intelligence and air power across the Middle East. Bahrain anchors operations in the Gulf and protects maritime trade routes. Diego Garcia, shared, links Indian Ocean surveillance and strike operations. The Falklands secure the South Atlantic and Antarctica's approaches. Singapore and Brunei place British forces inside the Indo-Pacific's economic arteries. No European state, not Germany, not France, not Italy, possesses anything approaching this network. It's not quantity, it's positioning. These bases are the skeleton, but the nervous system is GCHQ. As the core of the Five Eyes intelligence network, GCHQ gives Britain access to a global signals intelligence grid the rest of the world spends billions attempting to breach. From intercepting Russian military communications to mapping Chinese cyber intrusions, Britain holds intelligence equity that no conventional military strength can replicate. Five Eyes isn't cooperation, it is strategic fusion. And GCHQ's 2025 revelations about AI-driven cyber detection barely scratch the surface. What wasn't publicly stated is more important. AI is now sifting terabytes of global digital exhaust to identify state-backed propaganda, encrypted trafficking networks, malware signatures, and hostile operational planning before adversaries finish typing. This is why Britain punches above its weight. Its bases provide the physical reach, its intelligence provides the strategic sight. Together, they give every British deployment, and from carriers to special forces, a clarity and tempo adversaries struggle to match. But intelligence and basing aren't enough without industrial power to sustain them. And this is where analysts continuously underestimate Britain. Because behind every deployment, every submarine, every strike group, and every special operations mission lies an industrial engine that most NATO states cannot replicate. Most nations build weapons. Britain builds capacity. And that distinction is what determines who survives a long war. The UK's defense industrial base is not large, but it is structured for something far more important: survivability under pressure. While other NATO states rely on international suppliers, fragile stockpiles, and decades-old manufacturing pipelines, Britain has been quietly hardening and expanding its industrial backbone at the exact moment global conflict risks are rising. The Defense Industrial Strategy 2025 made one decisive shift. Defense spending became an economic weapon, not an operational expense. That single policy reframed the entire sector. 6 new munitions factories, 1.5 billion pounds dedicated to rebuilding long-range weapon production, 7,000 new precision missiles entering procurement, protected supply chains for critical components, and a deliberate move toward domestic manufacturing for systems that most European nations still import. This isn't an industrial revival, it's industrial rearmament. BAE Systems, Kinetic, MBDA, Rolls-Royce, and a growing constellation of defense tech startups now operate inside a protected innovation ecosystem where government incentives, regulatory shields, and commercial dual-use technology compress development cycles. Britain's innovation curve is bending faster than any other European military economy because the UK's industrial base is designed around speed, iteration, and resilience. This is how Britain sidesteps the problem of scale. You don't need an industrial giant if you can innovate faster than the giant can mobilize. You don't need millions of shells if your targeting is so precise that you need fewer to achieve greater effect. Russia floods the battlefield with mass. Britain shapes it with precision. And unlike the United States, whose defense manufacturing is tangled in global supply chains and political gridlock, the UK is increasingly insulated. Much of its next-generation capability pulls from commercial sectors like AI, advanced materials, and aerospace engineering, giving Britain shorter development loops and lower costs. But here's the detail most analysts miss. This entire industrial strategy is oriented around one doctrine: NATO first. Every system, every budget increase, every production line is designed to strengthen the alliance, not dilute it. And that clarity is precisely what Europe depends on as the security environment fractures. NATO first is not a slogan. It is a doctrine, the spine around which the UK organizes procurement, posture, training, deployments, and industrial policy. At a time when Europe is split between hesitation, budget gaps, and political fragmentation, Britain is the only major European power that has eliminated uncertainty from its strategic decision-making. Germany debates, France hedges, Italy recalculates, Britain commits. This clarity has enormous operational consequences. When the UK invests £84 billion into defense, over a third goes directly into equipment. Far more than most NATO states can manage without breaking their budgets. When it commits to 2.6% of GDP by 2027, rising toward 3%, it signals something adversaries cannot afford to ignore. Britain is accelerating, not compensating. This means every year between now and 2035, British capability compounds on itself. New submarines, new carriers, AI-driven targeting, long-range fires, munition stockpiles, and modernized armored formations feeding into a fully interoperable NATO force. NATO doesn't need Britain to be huge. It needs Britain to be reliable, predictable, and lethally modern. And that is exactly what the UK is becoming. A modernized warfighting division by 2030. Challenger 3 tanks fielded with precision strike networks, Boxer carriers replacing outdated fleets, Ajax reconnaissance vehicles feeding data into the digital battlefield, long-range missile programs scaling beyond anything Europe has produced since the Cold War, all inside a force architecture designed explicitly for alliance operations. And this is the strategic truth most analysts still avoid. Britain's clarity forces adversaries to assume NATO unity even when European politics look fractured. The UK behaves as if Article 5 is already activated, which means any scenario involving Russia, and increasingly China, must now factor in a British response that arrives quickly, hits hard, and integrates instantly. Britain isn't a middle power managing relevance. It is the stabilizing anchor that turns NATO from a political club into a functioning warfighting alliance. But here's the twist that makes this final chapter matter even more. All of this capability has been built under constraint, under budget pressure, under decades of political turbulence, under an equipment plan that technically exceeds available funding. Britain isn't strong because it is wealthy. Britain is strong because it has learned to extract maximum strategic effect from limited resources, and still outperform its peers. So when the Strategic Defense Review's full funding arrives, when the 3% GDP threshold is hit, when the SSN AUKUS production ramps, when AI-driven lethality scales across the Army, when carriers, submarines, and long-range missiles converge into a single integrated force, the UK will not simply remain influential, it will become unavoidable. This is why, in 2026, the question is no longer whether the British military is a game changer. The question is how much the rest of the world has miscalculated by assuming it wasn't.